September 1944. A German supply officer named Klaus Richter stood in the ruins of what had once been a Wehrmacht logistics depot outside Metz, France. Around him, burned-out Opel Blitz trucks sat silent, their cargo of ammunition and rations still smoldering from an American air raid 3 days earlier. He had counted his remaining vehicles that morning. 11 trucks, 11 functional trucks to supply an entire division facing Patton's advancing Third Army. Then he heard it. That sound every German soldier on the Western Front had learned to recognize. A low, mechanical rumble that never seemed to stop. Through his binoculars, Richter watched them approach. American trucks, dozens of them. No, hundreds. All identical, all moving at the same steady pace, all carrying supplies that would reach the front lines before nightfall. Each one bore the same designation painted on its hood: GMC CCKW. The Americans called it the Deuce and a half, 2.5 tons of carrying capacity. But to Richter, staring at that endless convoy, it represented something far more terrifying. Proof that Germany had already lost the war, not on the battlefield, but in the factory. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Richter was witnessing was the single most produced vehicle of World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories built 562,750 GMC CCKW trucks. More than 500,000 identical vehicles rolling off assembly lines in Pontiac, Michigan, at a rate that defied every assumption German military planners had made about American industrial capacity. These weren't sophisticated weapons systems or cutting-edge technology. They were simple, brutally functional trucks designed to carry cargo across any terrain in any weather. And they would move more than 400 million tons of supplies during the war, an amount so staggering that it exceeded the total industrial output of the entire Axis alliance. The story of how a 2.5-ton truck became America's secret weapon begins not with military planners or generals, but with engineers who understood a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Wars are won by the side that can move the most supplies to the most places at the most speed. Everything else, the tanks, the planes, the rifles, were useless without the logistics network to keep them fed, fueled, and fighting. And in 1941, the United States Army faced a crisis. It needed a truck that didn't exist yet. The American military had entered World War I with a hodgepodge of civilian vehicles converted for military use. Ford Model Ts, Chevrolet cargo trucks, even horse-drawn wagons supplemented with motorized transport. The result was a logistics nightmare. Different vehicles required different parts, different maintenance, schedules, different training for drivers. When a truck broke down in France during 1918, finding replacement parts meant searching through dozens of different supply depots, hoping someone had the right component for that specific make and model. Officers watched entire offensives stall, not because they lacked ammunition or fuel, but because the trucks that should have delivered those supplies sat immobilized, waiting for parts that never arrived. The lesson burned itself into the minds of American logistics planners: standardization. The next war would require standardized vehicles that could be mass-produced, easily repaired, and operated by soldiers with minimal mechanical training. When Congress finally authorized military expansion in 1940, the War Department issued specifications for what they called a tactical cargo truck. The requirements seemed simple enough: carry 2.5 tons of cargo across roads, mud, sand, and snow. Survive mechanical abuse from drivers with limited experience. Be simple enough that field mechanics could repair it with basic tools. And most critically, be producible in quantities that would make logistics limitations irrelevant. General Motors received the contract, specifically its GMC truck division based in Pontiac, Michigan. The engineers assigned to the project understood they weren't designing a vehicle for peacetime commercial use. This truck would operate in deserts where temperatures reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit, in Russian winters where oil froze solid, across Pacific islands where salt air corroded metal within weeks, and through European mud that swallowed vehicles whole. It needed to be indestructible, or at least close enough that broken trucks could be cannibalized to keep others running. The GMC CCKW that emerged from those design sessions looked almost disappointingly simple. A 6-cylinder engine producing 91 horsepower, a 4-speed transmission with a 2-speed transfer case for shifting between highway and off-road gearing. 6 wheels instead of 4, with the rear 4 powered by dual axles that distributed weight and provided redundancy if one axle failed. An open cab with a canvas top that offered minimal protection from weather or enemy fire. And a cargo bed that could carry 5,000 pounds of ammunition, food, fuel, or anything else the military needed moved. What made the design revolutionary wasn't any single component, but how those components worked together as a system optimized for mass production and field reliability. The engine used the same basic design as GMC's civilian truck motors, which meant mechanics already knew how to repair it without specialized training. The transmission could be assembled from interchangeable parts, allowing damaged units to be rebuilt in field workshops rather than shipped back to factory depots. The suspension used leaf springs simple enough that a competent mechanic could replace them in under an hour. Every design choice prioritized functionality over sophistication, reliability over performance, and above all, the ability to build these trucks in numbers that would overwhelm any opponent through sheer quantity. Production began in January 1941 at GMC's Pontiac facility, months before Pearl Harbor brought America officially into the war. The assembly lines moved with the methodical precision that had made Detroit the center of American automotive manufacturing. Workers bolted engines to frames, attached transmissions, mounted axles, and installed cargo beds in a choreographed sequence that transformed raw steel and rubber into functional vehicles at a rate of 1 truck every 6 minutes during peak production. By December 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, GMC was already producing over 1,500 CCKW trucks per week. Within 6 months, that rate had doubled. By 1943, the Pontiac plant operated 24 hours a day with 3 shifts of workers who assembled trucks faster than the military could distribute them to units. The facility consumed steel at rates that required dedicated rail lines just to keep assembly lines supplied. Tire production demanded so much rubber that the War Department prioritized CCKW manufacturing over civilian automobile production, effectively shutting down America's peacetime auto industry to ensure adequate military truck supplies. The scale of production transformed Pontiac into something resembling a wartime fortress. Guards checked identification at every entrance. Workers received clearances before accessing assembly areas. The facility sprawled across millions of square feet with separate buildings for engine assembly, body manufacturing, and final vehicle construction. Overhead conveyors moved components between buildings, while trucks rolled off final assembly lines directly onto railroad flat cars for transport to military depots across the United States. What emerged from those assembly lines was more than just a truck. It was a symbol of American industrial philosophy applied to warfare, where German military vehicles emphasized engineering excellence and specialized capabilities. The CCKW represented brute force simplicity. It couldn't outperform German trucks in any single category. The Opel Blitz was faster. Mercedes-Benz military trucks were more comfortable. But the CCKW could be built in quantities that made individual vehicle performance irrelevant. By the time German factories produced one specialized truck, American assembly lines had built 10 CCKWs, and in modern warfare, 10 adequate trucks beat one excellent truck every single time. The first CCKWs arrived in Britain during early 1942, shipped across the Atlantic in convoys that dodged German U-boats. British logistics officers examined the vehicles with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The trucks seemed crude compared to British military. Vehicles with their open cabs, minimal weather protection, and basic suspension systems. One British quartermaster famously reported that the CCKW looked like something assembled from spare parts rather than a purpose-built military vehicle. Then they put the trucks to work, and skepticism transformed into appreciation. The CCKW could carry its rated load across terrain that immobilized British vehicles. Its six-wheel drive system distributed weight effectively enough that trucks drove through mud that would have trapped four-wheeled vehicles. The simple engine design meant British mechanics could perform field repairs without waiting for specialized American parts or technical assistance. And most importantly, there were enough CCKWs that losing a few to mechanical failure or enemy action didn't impact operations. When a British supply convoy lost vehicles to breakdown or bombing, replacement trucks appeared within days, sometimes hours, pulled from reserves that seemed inexhaustible. North Africa tested the CCKW's design in ways that no proving ground could replicate. Desert sand infiltrated every mechanical component. Temperatures exceeded design specifications by 30 degrees. Salt air from the Mediterranean corroded exposed metal, and supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across terrain where a broken-down truck could mean death for its crew if rescue didn't arrive before water ran out. The CCKW survived conditions that destroyed more sophisticated vehicles through sheer mechanical simplicity. Sand-clogged air filters, but the engine kept running on reduced efficiency until mechanics could clean the system. Heat-stressed cooling systems, but the redundant design meant trucks could limp to repair depots even with damaged radiators. Corrosion attacked body panels and cargo beds, but the critical mechanical components, engine, transmission, axles, remained functional long after the truck's exterior had deteriorated. General Bernard Montgomery's advance across North Africa following the victory at El Alamein in November 1942 relied almost entirely on CCKW logistics. British forces captured over 30,000 Axis soldiers during the pursuit, along with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. Every prisoner required food and water. Every captured vehicle needed fuel for transport to rear areas. And every British unit racing westward toward Tunisia consumed ammunition and supplies at rates that exceeded anything Montgomery's logistics staff had experienced in previous campaigns. The CCKWs made it possible. Convoys of 200 trucks or more moved continuously across desert tracks, delivering supplies to units that had advanced so rapidly they outpaced their own supply lines. When trucks broke down, field mechanics cannibalized parts from irreparable vehicles to keep others running. When German aircraft strafed convoys, destroyed trucks were pushed aside while intact vehicles continued their missions. The numbers told a story that traditional military logistics couldn't explain. Montgomery's forces advanced over 1,400 miles in 3 months while maintaining combat effectiveness that required constant resupply. German forces, equipped with what many considered superior vehicles, collapsed not from battlefield defeats, but from supply shortages that left entire divisions immobilized for lack of fuel and ammunition. The difference wasn't tactical excellence or strategic brilliance. It was trucks. Specifically, the ability to field enough trucks that individual losses became statistically irrelevant rather than operationally catastrophic. By mid-1943, the CCKW had proved itself in 2 theaters, Africa, and Europe, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded design specifications. But the vehicle's most significant test lay ahead in the Pacific, where terrain, climate, and distances would challenge every assumption about motorized logistics. The islands scattered across the Pacific presented conditions that seemed designed to destroy military vehicles. Jungle humidity rotted rubber and corroded metal. Coral sand shredded tires and damaged suspension systems. Monsoon rains transformed dirt roads into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles. And volcanic ash infiltrated engines with an abrasiveness that wore out components in weeks rather than months. The CCKW adapted to Pacific conditions through modifications that reflected lessons learned in previous theaters. Waterproofing protected electrical systems during amphibious landings where trucks drove through several feet of surf before reaching beaches. Heavy-duty air filters handled volcanic dust and coral sand that would have destroyed standard filtration systems. Reinforced suspension components absorbed punishment from terrain that featured more craters and obstacles than actual roads. And corrosion-resistant coatings protected critical components from salt air that turned untreated metal into rust within days. But modifications only went so far. The real key to CCKW's success in the Pacific was quantity. American logistics planners shipped trucks to island bases in numbers that assumed 50% mechanical failure rates within 6 months. They pre-positioned spare parts in quantities that allowed complete vehicle rebuilds from component inventories, and they trained mechanics to perform field repairs that kept trucks operational long past their intended service lives. When a CCKW broke down on Guadalcanal or New Guinea or Saipan, another truck immediately replaced it from reserves that seemed unlimited. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated how CCKW logistics had transformed American military capabilities in the Pacific. The invasion force required supplies on a scale unprecedented in amphibious warfare. Over 540,000 troops needed daily rations, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, and replacement equipment. Combat operations consumed ammunition at rates that exceeded anything experienced in European campaigns, and the island's terrain, mountainous, heavily fortified, and lacking developed roads, meant that every supply movement required vehicles capable of operating under extreme conditions. The CCKWs performed beyond every expectation. Over 4,000 trucks operated continuously throughout the 3-month campaign, delivering supplies to frontline units that advanced through terrain where traditional logistics would have been impossible. They drove through artillery fire to reach isolated units. They transported wounded soldiers from aid stations to field hospitals. They carried artillery shells to gun positions that fired thousands of rounds daily. And when trucks were destroyed by enemy fire or mechanical failure, replacement vehicles arrived from supply depots that maintained reserves specifically for this purpose. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese defenders on Okinawa watched American supply convoys with a desperation born from understanding their own logistical collapse. While American trucks delivered hot meals and ammunition to frontline positions, Japanese soldiers survived on rice rations that had dwindled to handfuls per day. American artillery fired preparatory bombardments that consumed more shells in hours than Japanese forces possessed in their entire inventory. And American casualties received medical treatment that saved lives, which would have been lost in any previous conflict. All because trucks could evacuate wounded to hospital ships within hours of injury. The strategic impact extended beyond simple supply delivery. The CCKW's reliability meant American commanders could plan operations assuming logistics wouldn't constrain tactical options. They could commit forces to offensives knowing supplies would reach frontline units. They could sustain campaigns for months rather than weeks, because truck convoys operated continuously without breaking down, and they could accept higher casualty rates, both human and material, because replacement systems functioned efficiently enough to restore combat power within days rather than weeks. German intelligence officers studying American logistics in late 1944 produced reports that their superiors initially dismissed as exaggerated. The numbers seemed impossible. American forces operating in France consumed 15,000 tons of supplies daily, a figure that exceeded Germany's entire logistical capacity for the Western Front. Individual American divisions possessed more trucks than entire German army groups, and the Americans maintained supply stockpiles sufficient for months of continuous operations, while German forces rationed fuel and ammunition for immediate tactical needs. The reports were accurate. By autumn 1944, the United States had positioned over 240,000 CCKW trucks in the European theater alone. That number exceeded the total vehicle inventory of the German Wehrmacht on both Eastern and Western fronts combined. And unlike German trucks, which required constant maintenance and specialized parts, the CCKWs operated with a reliability that allowed continuous service under conditions that would have immobilized any other vehicle fleet in history. German General Wilhelm Keitel reviewed these intelligence assessments in his East Prussia headquarters with growing alarm. The mathematics were inescapable. Even if German forces achieved tactical victories that destroyed American equipment at favorable ratios, American production replaced losses faster than Wehrmacht forces could inflict them. For every CCKW destroyed in combat, 3 more rolled off assembly lines in Pontiac. For every ton of American supplies captured or destroyed, 5 more tons reached frontline units the following day. The war had become a contest between German tactical excellence and American industrial capacity, and industrial capacity was winning. The Red Ball Express represented the ultimate expression of CCKW capabilities applied to operational necessity. When Patton's Third Army raced across France in August 1944, consuming fuel faster than supply lines could deliver it, American logistics officers created the largest truck convoy in military history. Nearly 6,000 CCKWs operated continuously along designated routes that stretched from Normandy beaches to front-line positions 400 miles inland. The trucks ran 24 hours per day with drivers who swallowed amphetamine pills to stay awake during shifts that often exceeded 20 hours. The operation violated every principle of military logistics that German planners considered fundamental. Convoys operated with headlights illuminated, making them visible to enemy aircraft from miles away. Trucks maintained minimum speeds of 25 miles per hour, even through areas where slower movement would have improved fuel efficiency. Broken-down vehicles were pushed into ditches rather than recovered, a practice that seemed wasteful by German standards but made perfect sense in a logistics system where replacement trucks were unlimited and time was critical. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed Red Ball Express convoys with a mixture of professional interest and strategic despair. The images showed lines of trucks stretching beyond the horizon, moving in formations so dense that individual vehicles blurred together into a continuous stream of mechanical traffic. One Luftwaffe pilot reported counting over 300 trucks in a single convoy, then added in his mission report that the count was certainly incomplete because the convoy's end had extended beyond his visual range. The psychological impact on German forces proved as devastating as the material effects. Soldiers hearing the constant rumble of truck engines night after night began to understand that American supply capabilities exceeded anything their own logistics could match. Every American artillery barrage, supplied by CCKW ammunition trucks, demonstrated resource abundance that German forces could never replicate. Every American meal of hot food, delivered by CCKW field kitchens, contrasted with German rations that had shrunk to bread and thin soup. And every destroyed American vehicle, quickly replaced by identical trucks that appeared within hours, proved that individual tactical victories couldn't overcome strategic industrial disparities. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested American logistics under the worst possible conditions. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise, breaking through American lines and threatening to split Allied forces in Belgium. Supply lines that had operated smoothly for months suddenly faced disruption as German tanks advanced through rear areas where logistics units had operated without enemy interference since D-Day. Roads became contested terrain. Supply depots fell to German capture, and American forces found themselves fighting not just for strategic objectives, but for basic survival as ammunition and fuel supplies dwindled. The CCKW fleet responded with a flexibility that German planners had not anticipated. Within 48 hours of the German offensive start, American logistics officers rerouted thousands of trucks away from supporting Patton's advance toward the Saar and redirected them north toward the Ardennes. The convoys moved through winter conditions that would have immobilized less capable vehicles. Ice-coated roads that climbed through mountainous terrain. Snow reduced visibility to distances measured in feet rather than miles. And German fighters, operating from nearby airfields during brief periods when weather cleared, strafed convoys that couldn't take cover due to narrow roads bordered by steep embankments. The trucks kept moving. Drivers chained tires for better traction on ice. Mechanics worked in sub-zero temperatures to repair frozen fuel lines and damaged engines, and convoy commanders organized movements that delivered critical ammunition and fuel to surrounded American units at Bastogne and other defensive positions. The supplies arrived just in time. American forces holding Bastogne consumed ammunition at rates that would have exhausted their stockpiles within days without resupply. German forces attacking the perimeter expected American resistance to collapse once ammunition ran out, a calculation that worked when applied to German logistics but failed completely when facing American supply capabilities. General George Patton's relief of Bastogne depended almost entirely on CCKW logistics. His Third Army executed a 90-degree turn from offensive operations toward the Saar to a northward advance that covered over 100 miles in 48 hours. The maneuver required moving over 240,000 troops, with their vehicles, equipment, and supplies across icy roads, while maintaining combat readiness. Traditional logistics planning suggested such a movement would require weeks of preparation and gradual repositioning. Patton accomplished it in less than 3 days because his supply system didn't require preparation. It simply redirected existing truck convoys toward new destinations. The CCKWs, hauling fuel to Patton's tanks, operated under conditions that destroyed vehicles designed for peacetime commercial use. Loaded trucks weighed over 14,000 pounds, far exceeding safe weight limits for icy roads. Drivers maintained speeds that risked loss of control on curves where guardrails didn't exist. And mechanical failures occurred with increased frequency as cold temperatures stressed components already worn from months of continuous operation. But the trucks kept moving because American logistics accepted high failure rates as inevitable costs in systems designed around redundancy and rapid replacement. German officers watching American supply convoys during the Battle of the Bulge recognized that their offensive had failed not at the tactical level, but at the strategic foundation. Even if German forces captured Antwerp and split Allied armies as planned, American logistics would reconstitute shattered units faster than German forces could exploit tactical gains. The Wehrmacht could destroy American divisions, but new divisions arrived from the United States within weeks, fully equipped and supplied. German forces could capture supply depots containing thousands of tons of materials, but American stockpiles were so vast that these losses represented acceptable costs rather than operational catastrophes. By January 1945, German resistance in the Ardennes had collapsed. American forces had recaptured lost territory and resumed their advance toward the Rhine. The brief German success had cost the Wehrmacht its last mobile reserves, sacrificed in an offensive that achieved temporary tactical gains but accelerated strategic defeat. And throughout the campaign, CCKWs had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies to American units, maintaining combat effectiveness that allowed rapid recovery from initial setbacks. The final months of the European War demonstrated how completely CCKW logistics had transformed American military capabilities. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they did so supported by supply systems that could sustain advances of 50 miles per day while maintaining combat power that earlier armies could only achieve during brief offensive surges. American units advancing into Germany consumed ammunition and fuel at rates that would have bankrupted any previous military campaign. Artillery bombardments fired tens of thousands of shells daily. Tank divisions burned fuel in quantities that exceeded the entire daily consumption of some German army groups. And infantry units received regular resupply of everything from rifle ammunition to cigarettes, maintained at levels that ensured soldiers never faced supply shortages that might reduce combat effectiveness. The CKKWs made it all possible. Over 300,000 trucks operated in the European theater by April 1945, moving supplies from port facilities to frontline units across a logistics network that spanned hundreds of miles. The trucks operated continuously, with maintenance performed during brief stops rather than extended overhauls. Damaged vehicles were cannibalized for parts that kept other trucks running, and the constant rumble of engines became the soundtrack of Germany's defeat, a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped, never slowed, and never gave German forces time to recover from one defeat before the next offensive began. German civilians watching American convoys enter their cities understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. These weren't conquerors arriving on horseback or in commandeered civilian vehicles. These were professional soldiers supported by logistics systems that made occupation sustainable indefinitely. American trucks delivered food to displaced persons camps, fuel to generator stations, and medical supplies to hospitals, overwhelmed by wounded soldiers and civilians. The vehicles that had powered military conquest now enabled reconstruction on scales that German infrastructure couldn't match even before Allied bombing had destroyed factories and transportation networks. Soviet forces advancing from the east encountered American supply systems at the Elbe River in April 1945, with reactions that ranged from professional respect to ideological confusion. Soviet logistics relied on railways and horse-drawn wagons, supplemented by American-supplied trucks delivered through Lend-Lease programs. The Red Army's advance had stretched supply lines to breaking points multiple times, forcing operational pauses that allowed German forces to regroup and establish new defensive positions. But American forces facing the same distances maintained continuous offensive momentum, because their truck-based logistics didn't depend on railways that could be destroyed or require the extensive preparation necessary for horse-drawn transport. Soviet officers examining American supply depots reported back to Moscow with assessments that Soviet industrial planners initially dismissed as propaganda. American units possessed supply stockpiles sufficient for months of operations, including luxuries like coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes alongside military necessities. Individual American soldiers received more supplies in a week than Soviet troops consumed in a month. And the trucks delivering these supplies operated with a reliability that Soviet vehicles, many of them American-made Studebakers, delivered through Lend-Lease, could only approximate under ideal conditions. The contrast between American and Soviet logistics revealed fundamental differences in how the two nations approached industrial warfare. Soviet doctrine emphasized human endurance and acceptance of material limitations, creating armies that could function effectively despite supply shortages that would have paralyzed Western forces. American doctrine treated supply shortages as engineering problems to be solved through superior production and logistics, creating armies that never experienced material limitations because industrial capacity ensured adequate supplies always remained available. The Pacific Theater's final campaigns demonstrated CCKW capabilities under the most extreme conditions of the entire war. The invasion of the Philippines in October 1944 required supplying over 200,000 troops across an archipelago where roads barely existed and terrain ranged from jungle lowlands to volcanic mountains. Traditional logistics would have relied on coastal shipping to move supplies between islands, then animal transport or human porters to move materials inland. But American forces possessed over 15,000 CCKWs in the Philippines theater, enough trucks to motorize supply systems that operated under conditions where motor vehicles had never been considered practical. The trucks drove through rivers because bridges didn't exist. They climbed mountain trails carved by hand tools because engineering equipment hadn't yet arrived. And they delivered supplies to frontline units fighting in terrain where every mile advanced required clearing Japanese defensive positions from jungle so dense that visibility extended only a few yards. The CCKW succeeded because they were simple enough that field mechanics could repair them using improvised tools and cannibalized parts, and because American logistics accepted high failure rates as inevitable in exchange for supply delivery that maintained combat operations. Iwo Jima's invasion in February 1945 presented unique challenges that tested CCKW design limits. The island's volcanic sand damaged tires and clogged air filters. Salt spray from surf landing corroded exposed metal within hours, and the island's small size meant that every vehicle operated under observed enemy fire from Japanese positions in caves and fortified bunkers. Over 400 CCKWs landed on Iwo Jima during the first week of operations, driving through surf that reached above their wheel hubs, then climbing volcanic sand beaches that immobilized lighter vehicles. The trucks lost traction on ash that behaved like liquid when weight concentrated on individual tires. Drivers learned to maintain constant momentum because stopping meant getting stuck in sand that required tow trucks to escape. Mechanics replaced air filters multiple times daily as volcanic dust infiltrated engine compartments despite protective measures. And convoy commanders organized movements that minimized exposure to Japanese artillery fire, while ensuring ammunition reached frontline positions where Marines advanced yard by yard against defenders who fought from tunnel systems that survived even the heaviest American bombardments. Japanese soldiers watching American supply operations from their defensive positions recognized that Iwo Jima's capture was inevitable once American logistics established continuous supply delivery. Marine units consumed ammunition at rates that Japanese forces rationed to handfuls of bullets per soldier, found incomprehensible. American casualties received medical evacuation to ships offshore within hours, while Japanese wounded remained in caves without medical supplies. And American forces ate hot meals delivered by field kitchens that operated despite artillery fire, while Japanese defenders survived on rice balls and diminishing water supplies. The final casualty statistics from Iwo Jima revealed how CCKW logistics had changed the mathematics of island warfare. American forces suffered over 26,000 casualties during 36 days of combat, losses that exceeded those sustained in many previous Pacific campaigns. But the wounded received treatment that saved lives which would have been lost in earlier battles. Medical supplies remained adequate throughout the campaign. Blood plasma reached frontline aid stations within hours of requisition, and surgical facilities on hospital ships performed operations on wounded Marines evacuated from the battlefield before shock and blood loss could prove fatal. Japanese forces, by contrast, lost over 18,000 killed with minimal wounded because their logistics couldn't sustain defensive operations once American forces controlled the island's surface. Defenders trapped in cave systems ran out of ammunition and died fighting with improvised weapons or committed suicide rather than surrender. Medical supplies never reached underground positions where Japanese wounded died from infections that would have been treatable with basic antibiotics. And food supplies dwindled to nothing as American control of the island's surface prevented resupply from ships offshore. Okinawa's campaign from April through June 1945 demonstrated CCKW logistics operating at maximum scale and efficiency. Over 540,000 American troops required daily supply of everything necessary to sustain combat operations on an island that featured minimal infrastructure and hostile terrain. The CCKWs delivered over 1 million tons of supplies during the 3-month campaign, operating continuously despite Japanese artillery fire, kamikaze attacks on offshore supply ships, and monsoon rains that transformed dirt roads into mud rivers. The trucks adapted to Okinawan conditions through modifications that reflected accumulated wisdom from 3 years of Pacific warfare. Waterproofing protected electrical systems during constant rain. Heavy-duty suspensions absorbed punishment from roads damaged by artillery. Bombardment and reinforced cargo beds carried ammunition loads that exceeded design specifications but remained necessary to meet combat consumption rates that surpassed anything experienced in previous campaigns. Japanese defenders recognized that Okinawa's defense was doomed once American supply systems established reliable delivery to frontline units. General Mitsuru Ushijima's forces fought with tactical skill and desperate courage, but courage couldn't overcome material disparities so vast that individual Japanese soldiers faced American units that possessed more ammunition per man than entire Japanese companies. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Japanese soldiers surrendering during Okinawa's final weeks reported that constant American artillery bombardments, supplied by endless truck convoys, had broken their units' will to resist long before actual combat eliminated organized defense. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the Pacific War before planned invasions of Japan's home islands required logistics on scales that would have dwarfed even Okinawa's supply operations. But planning documents prepared for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan, revealed how CCKW logistics would have supported campaigns unprecedented in military history. Over 1 million American troops would have landed on Kyushu and Honshu, supported by truck fleets numbering in the tens of thousands. Supply requirements calculated at over 3 million tons per month would have demanded continuous convoy operations that made even the Red Ball Express seem modest by comparison. The CCKWs never had to prove themselves in Japan's home islands, but their contribution to victory was already complete. Between 1941 and 1945, GMC CCKW trucks had transported over 400 million tons of supplies across every theater of World War II. That figure exceeded the combined cargo capacity of every merchant ship in the world's commercial fleet, operating during the same period. The trucks had operated in deserts where temperatures exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit, in Arctic conditions where oil froze solid, across Pacific islands where terrain seemed designed to destroy vehicles, and through European winters that immobilized armies throughout military history. The final production numbers told a story that military historians would spend decades analyzing. 562,750 CCKW trucks built during 4 years of wartime production. That averaged over 380 trucks per day every day for 4 years straight. At peak production during 1943, GMC's Pontiac facility assembled one complete truck every 6 minutes around the clock. These resources consumed in CCKW production included over 2 billion pounds of steel, enough rubber to produce 15 million tires, and sufficient gasoline during testing and delivery to fuel a small nation's economy for a year. But statistics captured only part of the CCKW's significance. The trucks had transformed how modern militaries understood logistics and supply chain management. Before World War II, logistics remained a support function subordinated to tactical and strategic planning. Commanders designed operations based on what forces could achieve, then worried about supply afterward. The CCKW reversed this relationship. American commanders during World War II's final years planned operations based on what their logistics could sustain, knowing that truck-based supply systems made distance and terrain largely irrelevant to supply delivery. The doctrinal revolution extended beyond American military thinking. Soviet observers studying American logistics during the war's final months returned to Moscow with recommendations that would reshape Red Army organization for decades. British military planners recognized that their traditional reliance on railway-based supply chains had become obsolete compared to American truck mobility, and even French resistance fighters operating behind German lines reported that American supply drops often included CCKWs delivered by glider, allowing partisan forces to motorize their operations in ways that had been impossible when relying on captured German vehicles or civilian trucks. German General Alfred Jodl, signing surrender documents in May 1945, reportedly commented to an aide that Germany had been defeated not by superior tactics or strategic brilliance, but by American trucks. The observation, possibly apocryphal but strategically accurate, captured a truth that German military doctrine had failed to anticipate. Modern industrial warfare wasn't won by the side with better weapons or more courageous soldiers, but by the nation that could move more supplies to more places faster than any opponent could match. The CKW's post-war legacy extended far beyond military applications. Thousands of surplus trucks entered civilian service, where they became foundations for commercial trucking industries across the world. Construction companies used CCKWs for projects ranging from highway building to dam construction. Agricultural operations employed them for harvest transport and supply delivery to remote farming communities. And in developing nations throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America, surplus CCKWs provided motorized transport for regions where such capabilities had previously been impossible due to cost and maintenance requirements. The truck's mechanical simplicity ensured they remained operational for decades after the war ended. Vehicles built during 1943 operated commercially into the 1970s, accumulating over 1 million miles in some documented cases. The 6-cylinder engines proved so reliable that mechanics rebuilding CCKWs for commercial use often found original components still functional after 30 years of continuous operation. And the standardized parts design meant that maintaining aging trucks required only a modest inventory of common components rather than specialized parts that became unavailable as manufacturers discontinued production. Military historians analyzing World War II's outcome identified the CCKW as among the war's most decisive weapons, ranking it alongside radar, aircraft carriers, and atomic bombs for strategic impact. The trucks hadn't won battles through firepower or protected troops with armor. They had won the war by making American military power sustainable across global distances that should have strained supply systems beyond breaking points. Every advance, every offensive, every campaign succeeded, because CCKWs delivered the supplies that kept armies fed, fueled, and fighting long after opponents exhausted their more limited logistics capabilities. The German supply officer Klaus Richter, who had watched American truck convoys with despair outside Metz in September 1944, survived the war and spent his final years working as a civilian logistics consultant in West Germany. In an interview conducted during 1968, he reflected on the moment he realized Germany had lost the war. It wasn't during any particular battle or after any specific defeat. It was watching those American trucks roll past his position day after day, week after week, never stopping, never slowing, never showing any sign that their supply of vehicles or fuel or replacement parts would ever run out. Richter calculated that during 1 week in September 1944, he had observed over 5,000 American trucks pass his observation point. Germany's entire motor vehicle production for that month totaled fewer than 3,000 vehicles of all types combined. The mathematics were inescapable. America wasn't fighting a war. America was running an industrial production line that happened to output military victory as its final product. And the GMC CCKW, simple, reliable, and produced in quantities that defied comprehension, was the machine that made that production line possible. On assembly lines in Pontiac, Michigan, workers who had built those trucks returned to civilian automobile production in 1946, transitioning from military to commercial manufacturing with barely a pause. The facility that had produced over 500,000 CCKWs during 4 years of wartime operations resumed building civilian GMC trucks, using many of the same production techniques and design philosophies. The lessons learned, building vehicles capable of operating under the worst conditions imaginable, translated directly into commercial trucks that set reliability standards for the entire automotive industry. The CKDW's final legacy lives on every highway where commercial trucks move goods across continental distances, in every logistics network that treats rapid delivery as standard rather than exceptional, and in every military that understands logistics as strategy rather than support. The 2.5-ton truck that seemed so ordinary, so unsophisticated, so simple compared to the fighters and tanks and battleships that captured public imagination, had quietly revolutionized how modern civilization moves materials from where they are to where they're needed. 400 million tons. That number, almost incomprehensible in its magnitude, represented the CCKW's contribution to Allied victory. It equaled moving every building material used to construct New York City from one side of the continent to the other. It exceeded the total cargo capacity of every merchant ship afloat during the war. And it proved that sometimes the most important weapon in any conflict isn't the one that destroys enemies, but the one that ensures your own forces never run out of everything else they need to keep fighting. The GMC CCKW never won a battle by itself. It never destroyed an enemy position or defended against an attack, but it won World War II more certainly than any tank, any plane, or any ship because it made every other weapon effective. And in doing so, it wrote the final chapter in a story that began with German generals laughing at American logistics capabilities and ended with those same generals signing surrender documents, defeated not by courage or tactics, but by trucks that never stopped rolling.